Hello everyone. It feels a bit weird sitting here alone in my room and recording this, but I guess more of you will have this experience, and I hope I will still be able to convey my message clearly. I will discuss my review, which is titled A Roadmap to Institutionalize Service Learning in Higher Education Institutions, a systematic review examining factors and operational strategies over time. First, I'd like to quickly introduce myself. My name is Geertje Tijsma. I'm a researcher and lecturer at the VU University in Amsterdam, the Netherlands. And the VU has the ambition to institutionalize service learning. And as a result of this ambition, a team of researchers is currently investigating strategies for implementing service learning in courses as well as on the institutional level. And my focus is specifically on the implementation on the institutional level, hence is also the current review. So, as most of you will know, modern society requires more and more people capable of complex thinking with communication, collaboration, and problem-solving skills. And as a result, many universities are now integrating forms of engaged learning, among which, of course, service learning, where students participate in and reflect on services that benefit the community. Even though universities are giving service learning more and more prominence, the successful institutionalization remains a challenge. And by institutionalization, we mean that service learning really becomes part of the institution's structures and culture so that it can be sustained in the long term. There's a pressing need for more research into the facilitating factors of institutionalization, but also how these factors relate to each other and how the process of institutionalization unfolds over time. And this is precisely what the current review aimed to address. I will now quickly take you through my methods. I won't put too much emphasis on this part. I will put my email address on the last slide of this presentation, so if you have any additional questions regarding this presentation, you can always feel free to contact me. So as I said, we did a systematic review. We did a database search in ERIC, Scopus, and PsycInfo, and we used very broad search strings. So one search string was considering higher education or universities or any derivative of that. The second string had to do with service learning or engaged learning or transformative learning or action learning or any derivative of that. And the third string had to do with organizational change or organizational development or institutionalization or any derivative thereof. So quite broad, these strings, and indeed we ended up with over 4,000 titles. Well, after removing the duplicates, 3,400 remained. And then we really looked into articles that were university-based engaged learning with a focus on institutionalization. So a lot were excluded because they were more on course level. Some were not really service learning as they were not involving an external partner. So in the end, we ended up with 122 articles. Well, we did a full text screening on these articles. And then we really looked into articles that focus on factors, but also operational strategies that contribute to successful institutionalization. And with that, we ended up with 26 unique titles. Well, this is just to quickly show you the titles we ended up with. They're quite diverse. There's some case study there, some comparative studies, some non-empirical papers. So it's quite a diverse range of literature that we ended up with. So within this systematic review, we aim to provide insight into the various factors contributing to the institutionalization process, but also how these factors relate to each other and how they may change over time. And for this purpose, the process of institutionalization has been segmented into its startup phase, where key individuals initiate service learning, the scale-up phase, where more and more stakeholders become involved, and finally the sustaining phase, where service learning really becomes part of the institution's culture. So all the factors and the strategies related to successful institutionalization were extracted from the aforementioned papers and attributed to either one of these phases. So the first phase we describe as the startup phase, and in this phase service learning is initiated by key individuals following either a top-down or a bottom-up approach. And within the top-down approach, service learning is initiated by governing boards, high-ranking administrators, or senior leadership figures. And within the bottom-up approach, service learning is initiated by active faculty members, students, or sometimes even community partners. So the first factor that we identified within this phase is to create a sense of urgency. Strategies to do so were to disseminate a report that highlights the importance of service or use service learning as a source for accreditation. This was often related to the top-down approach, as it was often initiated by high-ranking officials or administrators. The second factor we identified is to start small and explore existing resources. When exploring existing resources, one could conduct a campus-wide survey, a listening tour, or in-person focus groups or discussions. Jung specifically mentions that one should be careful not to engage in widespread outreach and thereby overextend one's capabilities. And this links to the next factor, which is to do with securing funding opportunities. This could be done by external sponsorship, internal funding, or preferably a combination of the two. As Jung notes, the most common tactic for securing initial funding was to find some degree of internal funding, while relatively few secured just grant money alone. And then the final factor I like to discuss within the startup phase was to identify service learning champions. These could be faculty members, students, community partners, senior leadership, or presidents. As Bennett knows, this was by far the most common. Institutional champions were active champions who pushed service learning from the bottom up and remained engaged across multiple projects and over multiple disciplines, suggesting that the initiation of service learning is mostly a bottom-up approach. The second phase we discuss is the scale-up phase. When scaling up service learning, the aim is that more and more people within the institution decide to adopt service learning. And the process of scaling up is quite complex, as universities are loosely coupled organizations, meaning that institutions are divided into faculties, which are then divided into departments. And due to this departmentalization, scaling up is quite difficult because the exchange between departments is often limited. Therefore, communication and new collaborations are needed to scale up service learning. So the first factor we identified is to create and promote a shared vision. And when creating such a vision, it was suggested that we define service learning in collaboration with faculty members. Moreover, the article suggests that it would be a better beneficiary to create an action-oriented mission statement. The second factor we identified is to raise awareness. So one could provide data on the benefits of service learning, use town meetings, workshops, seminars, and committee meetings, for example. The third factor we identified was to provide faculty rewards and support. It was emphasized that it's important to celebrate short-term wins, but also, for example, to hire students as liaisons or give faculty course release time. As Ward notes, reward early change agents and seek additional momentum by gaining support from previously neutral individuals. And then the fourth factor was to develop a centralized office or unit. And it was suggested that this office should be placed under the Chief Academic Office. But one could also, for example, develop an online portal that could serve as a meeting place. Then it was suggested that building internal coalitions is an important factor. Indeed, open lines of communication were said to be important, and to increase peer-to-peer learning, one could use, for example, lunch sessions. Forming external partnerships was also an important factor when scaling up service learning. It was suggested to hire a liaison and to hold workshop at community sites instead of in the university itself. And finally, within the scale-up phase, it was suggested that to conduct regular assessment and action research. So, for example, to conduct a collaborative cost-benefit analysis to inform best practices, but also to integrate action research into the process of institutionalization. As Chadwick and Pulowski note, the use of a self-assessment rubric will enable institutions to target for change specific components for each dimension of service learning support. The final phase is the sustaining phase. So for service learning to become fully institutionalized, it must by definition become part of the university's culture. And in this context, the importance of a university-wide intentional change or strategic planning is often mentioned. And therefore the strategies in this phase concern formalizing many of the above mentioned factors and often address the university as a whole. So the first factor we identified is to formalize service learning within educational structures. It was, for example, suggested to add service learning to accreditation guidelines or to establish service learning requirements for graduation. The second factor we identified was to formally add service learning to the promotion and tenure process and job descriptions. So, for example, we could attribute engagement in staff position descriptors or departmental guidelines. It was also suggested to include support for service learning in leader searches. As Ward notes, the faculty member who feels research is the focus of the reward structure may steer away from service learning. Consequently, specific guidelines stressing service learning as a component of promotion and tenure are needed. The third factor we identified is to create ongoing funding opportunities. Hereby, it's important to keep in mind the slow pace of institutional change. One cannot just rely on external grants, but should also ensure some form of internal grants. And it was suggested that one should make sure that grant applicants specify their considerations in terms of sustainability. The final factor we identified in the sustaining phase is that to make service learning an optional part of the core curriculum. It was suggested to integrate service learning into existing, required or not, courses and to introduce it as an optional or separate program. This systematic review aimed to provide insights into the factors and related strategies that can contribute to the institutionalization of service learning over time. I described the process in its startup, scale-up and sustaining phases. So the startup phase is described by either a top-down or bottom-up approach, and within the top-down approach mostly a sense of urgency is created. Often one relies on internal funding and the champions are senior leadership figures. The bottom-up approach uses the exploration of existing resources, mostly based on external funding, and the champions are faculty, students or partners. The second phase that I described within this review is the scale-up phase. And within this phase, more and more people need to decide if they want to adopt service learning practices. And interestingly, we found that the factors identified within this phase link up very well with the innovation decision process model as it is proposed by Rogers. So Rogers describes 5 phases within the innovation decision process: knowledge, persuasion, decision, implementation and confirmation. And as you can see, they link quite well to our factors. So knowledge occurs when an individual is exposed to innovation, so awareness is raised. Persuasion considers the favorable or unfavorable attitude towards the innovation, so a shared vision should be promoted and reward should be given. Subsequently, the decision to either adopt or not adopt is made, and next the implementation occurs, and then it's when the innovation is put to use, and here support, centralized office, internal coalitions and external partnerships become important. And finally, confirmation occurs when a person's decision can be reinforced, so assessment and hereby making service learning and evidence-based becomes important. The final phase, as described by the systematic review, is the sustaining phase, and it is argued that when more and more people are choosing to adapt service learning, certain structures should be formalized. So, for example, educational structures should be formalized for CSL, and one could include service learning in the promotion and tenure procedures. It's also important to create ongoing internal funding and to make service learning part of the core curriculum. It has to be said that while this figure might suggest a linear institutionalization process, this is not the case. Factors may run in parallel or find their efficacy in different phases. The factors related to confirmation, for instance, extend beyond the scale-up phase. Assessment can also reinforce continuous adaptation of CSL and thereby adding to the sustaining phase. Moreover, assessment of best practices can be used to raise awareness and promote a shared vision, thus finding its efficacy in the beginning of the scale-up phase. Another example that demonstrates the non-linearity of these factors is that of accreditation. When an institution adopts a top-down approach, within the startup phase, accreditation may be used to create a sense of urgency. However, accreditation can also be used to formalize educational structures and thereby adding to the sustaining phase of service learning. And with that, I would like to conclude my presentation. Thank you very much. I've described various factors and related strategies that can contribute to successful institutionalization over time. And I think an important take-home message from this presentation is the importance of individual decision-making when institutionalizing service learning. In the end, it's up to the individuals to decide if they want to adopt service learning practices. If you have any suggestions or questions, please feel free to contact me. Thank you.